What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be doing some street photography breakdowns, looking at some of my photographs from traveling throughout the world over the past decade, mastering street photography. Essentially, I want to give you guys the behind the scenes of how I made these photographs. I want to share with you the story behind the photograph. I want to share with you how I break down the compositions and essentially what makes these photographs so great. And so the first example I'm going to be sharing with you is this photograph I made in Jericho, brothers in Jericho. And so this is a photograph I made after spending some time in a masjid, praying amongst a group of brothers. And so essentially I traveled to Jerusalem to study abroad at Hebrew University. And for 6 months I traveled all throughout the West Bank and all throughout Israel. And during my time there, I spent a lot of time in Jericho. And I fell in love with this place because it was so close to Jerusalem. And I could simply take the bus from Jerusalem to Jericho pretty much every single day on the weekends and make photographs. And I found that the landscape of Jericho and the people of Jericho was just aesthetically beautiful, and the people were so nice. And so I found myself curious about the mosques, and I wanted to make photographs inside the mosques. I wanted to experience the culture generally. And so I decided to step in and I started to pray. And after mass after prayer, Salah, I'm a Christian, so it's kind of like mass, is that not like a universally used term? I'm not really sure. Yeah, after the prayer session, I was sitting outside of the mosque, and a group of brothers came and sort of just joined in, drinking tea, enjoying coffee, smoking cigarettes, and I hung out for a bit, right? I sat outside just chatting with the strangers, chatting with the group of brothers from the masjid. And this is the art of simply being present when you're making photographs, right? I think for me, like, I approach the streets over my journey as a documentary photographer with the mindset of a street photographer, meaning I like to explore the world, I like to engage with people, I like to immerse myself in the different cultural experiences that life offers, but then I have the aesthetic visual palette and vision of a street photographer, recognizing decisive moments, candid moments, and putting together order within my frames. And so here we have the first element within the frame, which is what drew me in and what triggered me to make the photograph. And so as I'm sitting down and watching as the men are enjoying coffee and tea and smoking, I'm simply there and I'm waiting and I'm observant, and I raised the camera to my eye the moment I saw these two men come in to greet. And so as they came in to greet, I made the photograph, and that's what triggered me to make this image, obviously. And so we have the two men engaging in a beautiful kiss. In the background, we have the man smoking the cigarette and the hand gesture of the man with the small cup of coffee. And I made the decision to layer this photograph, but it came through my intuition of positioning my body in relationship to the men kissing and the background. And so we have this clean background. It's separating the subjects in the frame and giving the people a sense of ambiguous space where you can't really, like, this photograph is timeless, right? Like, there's no logos on the coffee, there's no, iconography on the shirts. There's nothing that's like telling you that this was made in 2017 or that this is a certain place. You could guess that it's made in the Middle East. But you can see that, like, the background, it's very clean. This is something I try to achieve when I'm on the street, is I like to make a photograph that is universal, is universally understood, is simple, and I like to fill my frames with visual and emotional impact and interest by getting close. And so by separating the subjects from this background, I was able to create this very simple, sweet moment that is tender and warm and inviting, and I believe a very beautiful photograph due to the emotional impact and the visual cohesion of the composition. And so I really believe in this notion that, for me, like, I don't leave the scene until the scene leaves me, right? I encourage you to not leave the scene until the scene leaves you, meaning you're there. You're present when you press the shutter. You're not looking at the world as a photograph. You're not looking at life and, looking at images, right? You're experiencing the world. And when you're out there and you're photographing, recognize that photography has nothing to do with photography, but photography has everything to do with how you engage with humanity out there in the open world, on the front lines of life. And so what that means is you're responsible for being curious. You're responsible for being open and engaged. And when you're at a scene and you're making a photograph, don't leave until the scene unfolds, and don't leave until the scene leaves you. Be present when you press the shutter, and you'll be able to recognize these decisive moments. Example 2, moving on to bikers in Philadelphia. So here in Philadelphia, during the summertime, a lot of guys get together and show off their bikes. This was one moment in particular that I made an image of that I'm really fond of due to the way in which I use reflections at this scene. And it becomes a little bit more complex due to the nature of this image where there's lots of layers and depth. But I'm going to break it down really simply how I decided to make this compositional decision and why this photograph is impactful. And so first and foremost, I was engaged by this man's gaze on the left-hand side of the frame. And so I became really close to this subject, right? I became really close to the subject as I was noticing most of the people were already off of the bikes, but this man in particular was still sitting on his bike. I think he just arrived at the scene. And so as people come and go and move, I like to make photographs at these places. I like to find myself making photographs of movement and people. And so I became very intimate and got close to this guy. Maybe I actually believe I started talking to the guy. I started having a very brief conversation, asking him about his bike. I remember talking to him and I was asking him about, what kind of bike this is, yada, yada, yada. And so once again, using that documentary approach with the vision of a street photographer, being engaged at the scene, working the scene. And so as I started to make a quick conversation with the guy, he looked back at me and I made a frame of his gesture looking in my direction. Secondly, I want to make the emphasis that I was very intrigued by the reflections. Okay, so I'm looking at this mirror and I'm looking at this beautiful shape that the mirror makes. And I didn't notice in the moment that I made this photograph, but upon looking at the image, I realized that the man's helmet has shapes that echo the shape of the mirror, which adds this formal visual interest in the composition. And so I essentially decided to position my physical body in relationship to this mirror and the background where I'm facing this man that's within that mirror, within that reflection, and the man on the left-hand side who's looking back at me. And so I was trying to position my physical body to fit these puzzle pieces together. As much as photography is a visual game of putting together the foreground, middle ground, and background, photography is a very physical medium where you must physically position your body and move left to right to readjust and make these compositional decisions. And so by moving my physical body, I was able to find that sweet spot where that man that's seated upon that ledge there within the mirror was now visible in my frame. And so you can clearly see him circled in green there in the composition, and he's the focal point in the center of that mirror. Finally, we have the man on the right-hand side who's highlighted in blue, and he adds visual interest on the right-hand side of the frame. And I find that, once again, physically positioning myself was the key here, right? I'm physically moving slightly left, slightly right, and trying to adjust the composition to get it just right, where the pieces in the puzzle fit together, and that's the art of building a composition. And then finally, one of the other intrigues in the yellow circle is these people that are seated in that left-hand side within the mirror, all the way in the background. And this is a very small, minute detail. However, it's like one of those surprises that arises upon looking at the images after making them that really is kind of visually interesting and makes you go, wow, I got reflections everywhere. And so the background is a bit chaotic, but there's a lot of geometrical shapes from the ways in which those rectangles are formed on the building on the right-hand side. We have lots of leading lines from the ledge on the right-hand side where the man is seated. We have the buildings in the background with tall skyscrapers. We have the blue sky with the white clouds, and essentially a beautiful stage, a beautiful backdrop. And you can notice one other particular thing about this composition, that I really do fill the frame with a lot of interest. I have this man's face taking up about 1/3 of the frame, and so recognize that by filling the frame with impact, by getting physically close, you can make a stronger photograph. And so photography is visual problem solving. Photography is the art of putting together the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, and treating this world like a visual puzzle for you to solve. And so by repositioning your physical body in relationship to the different elements, to the different puzzle pieces, you're simply waiting and hoping for that last puzzle piece by moving, adjusting, and clicking the shutter again. And so this puzzle for me that I solved is actually quite like a puzzle due to the fact that I'm using this geometric shape here, sort of filling the frame with those reflections. and putting that subject within that mirror. And so example 3, girls in Mumbai. And so this is a photograph that I made in the spirit of play, something that came to me very naturally through gravitating to this very beautiful beach, this place that I was interested in Varsova. And so in Mumbai, there's this beautiful light that I found during the sunset. And so I decided to always go to a beach during the sunset. And so because of this, I gravitate to these locations. And so I was simply intrigued by the light itself. You know, the location, sure, is interesting, but there's something about my intuition telling me to visit these locations where the sunset will be visible, visiting these locations where I know the light will be beautiful. And then the scenes sort of naturally unfold from there. And so in the foreground, we have these 2 girls adjusting their makeup, and it was a very beautiful and sweet moment. And I spent a lot of time working the scene around these different families, and people got to know me. They invited me into their homes. They invited me into their spaces to make photographs and have a laugh and have a little bit of an engaging time. And so once again, this is the documentary approach with the street photographer's vision, engaging at the scenes, being playful, being open, being human at the end of the day. When you're traveling to new places, I believe it's important to embrace the spirit of play. And so in the background, very simply, these 3 subjects, these 3 girls, there's one girl actually carrying a boy on her arm in the middle of the frame, coming out from the background, and this fills the frame with visual interest and adds another layer to the image and dynamics to the image, where we have this very beautiful, emotional, still moment between the 2 girls in the foreground and this chaotic energy and movement in the background of the 3 girls perfectly separated upon this frame. And so the background is very simple. I'm looking down towards the beach. I'm using the sand, and I'm using this heap of trash here where the children are playing upon as my background. And so by separating the subjects from a clean background, you can create a photograph with more visual impact. Once again, creating a timeless image, something that's ambiguous, something that is sort of pulled out from the chaos of life, putting order to it by making a photograph that separates subjects cleanly and simply, creating a visual feast, allowing the subjects to fit upon my frame in a way that is easy to read. And so embrace the spirit of play. Embrace the spirit of play when you're on the streets. How to embrace the spirit of play? Embrace the child's mind, that childlike state within you where you want to just go out there with curiosity and courage at the forefront. Think of a kid when they put on a cape and they go to jump off the table and they have no fear. You should go out there and sort of just disappear in a flow state when you're making photographs, like a big kid just curious about life, embracing the spirit of play, and essentially not taking yourself so seriously. I really do believe that this is the secret to getting many of my best photographs. And so that's how I approach the streets, in the spirit of play, not taking myself so seriously, open and eager to seize the day. And so by embracing the spirit of play, I was able to engage with this community in this foreign place and come home with these emotional, close photographs. Example 4, boys in Zambia. And the reason why I wanted to share this example is because I was actually trying to make the point that I'm consistent. And so this photograph I made, I think it was in 2019. So this was before the Mumbai photo. And so this was a photograph I made during my Peace Corps service, where I spent about 12 months in Zambia, Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer. Unfortunately, I was pulled out early due to COVID-19. But I was here at the Seventh-day Adventist church camp for 2 weeks. I spent 2 weeks sleeping under thatched roofs, under these tarps with poles erected all throughout the land. And there were maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of Zambian people gathered at the lake for baptisms. And I was there and I was photographing each and every day of the church services, of the everyday life. And actually the photograph I made of the subject on the left-hand side is my host brother, Bwalia Jr. And this was the son of the host father I had in my Peace Corps service. And so I was very intimate with this man. I was very close to him. We spent every day together. We would go and to swim in the lake together. And so I was following him during, we would gather water from the well together. We would spend all day together. We'd ride bikes together. I remember this boy, I had him on the back of my bike, and we would bike to the nearby village because it was very far from his home. And we would, go to this restaurant and enjoy beautiful big fish that we couldn't find in our own personal village, or just go and explore and climb trees and gather mangoes. And yeah, I really miss this boy, Bwalia Jr. He was a really fun kid to hang out with. And, you know, that's the thing too with the documentary approaches. You have these, you know, like adventures and these like experiences and these memories and these stories. And then of course photographs. But if you're looking to travel and you want to have a enriching and deeper travel experience for photographers, I highly recommend the Peace Corps or any volunteer service. And so here we have boys in Zambia gathered at the lake Bangwelu to bathe. And so bathing in the lake is very common during this church camp and in general throughout Zambia. And so when I approached this scene, I made the compositional decision to include the bather as my main subject, filling one half of the frame with that gesture, with that visual interest. And so I look for gestures when I'm on the streets. Excuse me. Gestures trigger me, right? I see a gesture, I make a photograph. But when I analyze this particular scene, right, and I'm looking at life itself and I'm seeing, okay, there's a bather here, there's some boys over here, I make that very simple decision. Okay, bather on the left side, boys on the right side. Break the frame up left to right. And so I'm also making the compositional decision similar to my photograph of the girls in Mumbai, looking down at the subjects using now the blue water as my background. And so I just want to make that clear so that you can understand how I look at life and make these compositional decisions where I eliminate that horizon line and simplify the frame by using that blue background. And so we have the first element that takes up one half of the frame, Bwalia with his gesture, bathing, washing his head. And so on the right-hand side, we have the three subjects. We have these three boys who go from left, right to back again. And this adds another dynamic to the image. It adds not only just a visual element of layering and filling the composition, but it also helps tell the story of these boys that are bathing at the lake. And so finally, we have the background of the beautiful blue water from the lake. We have some grass that is emerging on the sides of the frame and in the foreground on the bottom. And so essentially I look at the life in front of me as a visual puzzle, right? I'm trying to solve that visual puzzle very intuitively and quickly by making these relationships in my head and moving my body to align these pieces. And so by placing the boy on the left-hand side in relationship to the other children on the right-hand side, it was the very simple compositional decision, and it happened through me just looking at life and recognizing where I must be to press the shutter at that right time, being triggered by the gesture, and everything else falls into place. And so this is the art of filling the frame and eliminating the distractions from the background. And so filling the frame is all about creating a visual feast with a photograph that is simple and easy to read with visual impact. And so I have here a couple of different elements. It's not that chaotic. It's very simple, actually. You know, we have a couple different layers here, but the frame is filled once again with one half of the frame with that gesture, with that visual interest. And so this is a very simple moment, and it's something that I believe anyone can achieve by getting close in proximity. You can find yourself more easily filling the frame. And so the art of filling the frame is also the art of getting close and spending time working the scene in order to create these kind of pictures. And so speaking of working the scene, here we have another example from this is the final example, example 5 of the dog beach in Tel Aviv. And so, you know, I spent some time in Tel Aviv while I was in Israel in 2017. And so this was one of my experiences. And I found that the dog beach was very interesting. You know, the dog beach provided so much energy. And I was drawn to the dog beach particularly because of the element of the dogs and the way the dogs would move around and jump around. There was just so many dynamics to work with, you know, people playing with their dogs, etc., etc. And so I decided to find myself at the dog beach. And so I like to find these choke points where I know that there's a lot of dynamic energy. And so this is a combination of me fishing at the scene and sort of being patient and playful. So essentially I found myself looking at this beautiful background. I looked at these beautiful people playing and engaging. We have this choke point of this man who's bathing and using the shower there in the background. And I could sense the possibility of a photograph here. And so essentially I set my stage and I waited for these first two dogs to enter the frame here in the foreground. And so I was aware of this scene that was unfolding around me. However, I was waiting for the dynamic energy of the dog beach, the dogs, to walk into my frame. And so this was me being patient and actually fishing and watching as life unfolds in front of me, sensing the possibility of a photograph due to the different dynamics and layers that I could make in relationship to the dogs that now enter the foreground. And so I was fishing, I was waiting for those dogs to enter the frame. And so I was aware of this, I was consciously that this was a possibility in my photograph. This isn't serendipity, this isn't luck, this is me actually forcing that by being patient and aware with observational skills and patience. And so once again, we have the middle ground here. So I'm breaking the frame from the foreground to the middle ground and the background. And here in the foreground, we have the dogs. In the middle ground, we have these people that are all playing upon the plain here in the sand. We have two people on the right-hand side playfully engaging. We have a woman on the left-hand side who's sunbathing. And then finally in the background there in the center of the frame, we have the man who's washing himself off in the shower. And then finally, the cherry on top in this photograph is that very emotional moment on the left-hand side and the far back side of the frame, circled in blue. We have that couple there that's engaging in a nice intimate moment, hugging each other, maybe kissing. And it's a very simple, sweet moment, but it's something that I believe carries the frame and puts it all together. When you have this sort of dynamic from the foreground to the middle ground and the background, it really does create a more dynamic frame. And so finally, the background is a very simple stage that I set using the sand and using those leading lines from the fence there and some of the architectural structures from the background there. And I found that this backdrop was beautiful and simple and easy to work with, which allowed me to then separate these different subjects upon the plane and give them some space so that the complexity of these layers were able to be a little bit easily digestible for a viewer, right? And so find a choke point and set your stage. This is what I did at this particular scene, right? I found myself at a choke point. I looked at the potential photograph to make here. I understood that the dog beach had lots of dynamics. There was people playing and hanging out here, and there were these dogs that kept coming in and out of the scene. And so I found this choke point to be perfect for my street photography here in Tel Aviv. And so I set my stage by being aware of the background elements, by being aware of the sand, of the landscape, of the architecture, of the ramp and the structures in the background that create leading lines and separate the subjects from that stage, from that backdrop. And so I find that by finding yourself at a choke point and setting your stage, being patient and fishing and waiting, you can force your luck and create these layered dynamic compositions very intuitively. And it comes through the art of observation and patience and being aware and being present when you press the shutter. And so these are some of my thoughts on street photography and looking at some of my photographs. And yeah, I just hope that you learned something today. If you want to learn more, please feel free to visit the website on the screen at dantesisofo.com. You can visit my Start Here page. I have a full guide on how I mastered street photography. I also have a few different resources on how I approach the streets there you can find. You can look at my contact sheets, etc. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. I do hope that you learned something today. Please stay tuned for more videos on street photography. Looking forward to breaking down more of my photographs, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.